The steps of iron legs clank on the cobblestones. But this is not the sound of a victory march. It is the thud of a prosthesis. Archaeologists found an iron leg in the Italian town of Capua, created not for adornment, but to stand on the ground again after battle. How much pain in each strike of these steps. And who forged a new life for the soldier instead of a lost limb? Historians wrote, veterans of Roman legions often returned home maimed. Polybius noted that warriors often lost arms or legs in battle, especially during close combat with swords and spears. But surprisingly, such people were not abandoned. Already in the 1st century BC, the state began to allocate compensation to injured legionaries, and craftsmen created the first prostheses for them, made of metal and wood. Thus appeared the term prothesis, from the Greek addition. It meant not just a piece of iron, but a return to life. These early prostheses resembled mechanical sculptures, bronze fingers, hinges connected by straps, and wooden cores to soften the impact when walking. The weight of such a leg could reach 3 kilograms, almost like a modern combat helmet. Imagine this image. A legionary who lost a leg in the Gallic War stands on the scorching stone of the Forum. The sun reflects off the polished metal, and each of his steps sounds like a challenge to fate. He walks again, perhaps slowly, perhaps with pain, but he walks. His iron leg not only supports the body, it transforms into a symbol of will. According to Roman inscriptions, injured soldiers could receive a plot of land or a pension, premia militiae, but not all were content with peace. Many, despite their injuries, returned to service, to the rear, to guard duties, to camp administration. One of the inscriptions found in the British province mentions a warrior who served as a scribe after an amputation. He could not fight with a sword, but he wrote reports for an entire legion. Archaeologists found the remains of several metal limbs, but it was the find from Capua, the so-called Capuan leg, that became a symbol of ancient Roman engineering. It dates back to approximately the 1st century BC and was discovered in the tomb of a middle-aged man. From its size and shape, it is clear the leg was custom-made for a specific person. The metal was laid over a wooden base and secured with leather straps, a primitive yet surprisingly precise system. This was an era when metal could be cold, but humanity warm. When engineering served not weapons, but hope. And if in our time a prosthesis is a matter of technology, for the Romans it was a matter of honor. For a warrior who lost a limb in battle, for Rome was not to become a pauper, nor disabled, nor forgotten. Yet the question arises, where did the readiness to help the injured come from in a society that valued strength and physical perfection? What compelled Rome to recognize the value of those who could no longer fight but could still be part of the empire? It all began with a war that changed the very understanding of body and duty. After the Second Punic War, in the middle of the 2nd century BC, Rome faced a new type of loss. Not death, but debilitating wounds. Polybius wrote that after the battles of Cannae and Zama, thousands of warriors were left without arms, legs, and eyes. These people could no longer stand in formation, but a legionary's heart still beat in their chests, and the state could not allow such hearts to rot in poverty. The Romans created a special system for supporting veterans, colonia veteranorum, settlements for former warriors. There they received land, a home, and the right to live without alms. But for those who lost limbs, this was not enough. As Livy recalled, veterans who sustained severe injuries demanded not pity, but the opportunity to work. And then blacksmiths and craftsmen began to invent what we today call medical engineering. An image of one such master has been preserved on a bas-relief from Ostia, a man in a short tunic holding a hammer and a saw, working on a metal part resembling a joint. These masters were called fabri, engineers and craftsmen capable of repairing not only catapults, but also a human. They did not have medical education in the modern sense, but possessed what the Romans called ars, an art born of experience and observation. One can almost hear the workshop smelling of coal and oil, sparks flying from the anvil, and behind the wall, someone trying out a new leg, carefully stepping on the stone. In this sound lies the transition from warrior to master, from war to life. Every hammer blow is not just the sound of metal, it is the rhythm of rebirth. One of the most famous examples is a hand prosthesis found in a tomb in Altheim in a Germanic province. It likely belonged to a veteran of auxiliary troops who served under Augustus. Archaeologists determined the construction included a bronze casing, leather straps, and a hinge allowing the fingers to bend. This was no longer a crude crutch. It was a mechanism conceived with engineering precision. Such a device could have been expensive, according to historians' estimates, the equivalent of a centurion's monthly salary. But veterans who had state support could afford it. For Rome, this was not charity, but an investment. After all, every restored veteran remained an example for new recruits. The empire does not abandon its own. The Romans saw the body as part of the state machine. As Cicero wrote, service to the homeland requires all members of the body, and if one is lost, honor demands to replace it with art. It is here that the concept which can be called the first military medicine is born. In the camps, next to the forges, healers, medici, operated. These were professional doctors attached to the legions. They not only bandaged wounds, but also advised the craftsmen creating prostheses, suggesting how to distribute the load so that a person could walk. The term medicus did not mean a surgeon in our understanding. This was a versatile physician. He knew how to suture wounds, cauterize wounds, and even amputate limbs. In Celsus's treatise De Medicina, it is described in detail how exactly such operations were performed. Celsus advised amputating no closer than 2 fingers from healthy tissue so that a skin flap could be applied, and an artificial leg later attached to it. Almost 2,000 years later, archaeologists find traces of these interventions, even bone cuts, traces from bronze instruments. This is evidence that Roman surgery was not barbarism, but a system. Every step in it had meaning. And now imagine, a legionary who yesterday lay in the infirmary, today takes his first steps on a wooden leg. His body trembles with pain. Sweat drips onto the ground, but he walks. His brothers in arms stand in formation and silently watch. They do not pity him. They envy his courage, because he proved, even having lost flesh, one can remain a soldier. This idea would become the foundation of Roman identity, a belief in the power of will over the body. But ahead of these iron people was yet another test. They needed not just to stand, but to fight again. And then metal became part of war. The first thing a veteran returning to formation with an iron leg heard was not applause, but the beat of a drum, the rhythm of the march, which demanded to keep pace. But his step sounded different. One strike, leather. Another, metal. This sound revealed him, made him a stranger among his own. And yet, in the Roman army there was no word invalid, only miles, a warrior. If you could hold formation, then you were alive. Historians note that by the 1st century AD, veterans with prostheses began appearing in some legions, performing tasks outside the battle line. They were placed on guard duty for warehouses, in command centers, and in communication services. Pliny the Elder wrote that such people often displayed no less courage than combat soldiers, because they fought not with their bodies, but with their will. Their example was used to train young recruits, to show that fear is not a severed leg, but lost resolve. Metal limbs became part of a new military culture. Unlike the modern world, where a wound signifies the end of a career, in Rome it transformed into proof of valor. From this arose the expression cicatrix gloriae, the scar of honor. The loss of an arm or leg could even elevate a veteran's status if he survived battle defending the legion's standard. Engineers and doctors began to refine the designs. Blacksmiths started using bronze instead of pure iron. It was lighter and did not rust. Leather pads were inserted into the hinges to reduce friction. Sometimes craftsmen incorporated movable fingers into the prosthesis, controlled by leather straps. All of this was created by hand for a specific person, each leg, each arm, like a work of art. In these details, Roman engineering was no less evident than in the construction of aqueducts, for the principles were the same: balance, load, elasticity. Archaeological finds from Pompeii show workshops where blanks for human joints lay next to bronze statues. This was no accidental proximity. Sculptors and blacksmiths used the same methods to recreate ideal forms. The term that accurately describes this phenomenon is opus. In Rome, it referred to any great creation, a temple, a fresco, or a weapon. But when a blacksmith forged a leg for a veteran, he also created an opus, a work in which metal and destiny were united. It was not merely a craft, but a service. Romans believed that the body was a temple of the spirit, and if the temple was damaged, it needed to be restored. Thus, the philosophy of stoicorum, resilience in the face of suffering, was formed. Stoics taught that pain was a test, not a condemnation. Seneca wrote that valor is shown not in avoiding suffering, but in suffering with dignity. And warriors with prostheses became living examples of this philosophy. On the battlefield, they did not always carry weapons, but their presence mattered. One veteran with a bronze arm could inspire an entire cohort. When he stepped forward to the formation, the sun reflected off the metal, and young soldiers saw in him not a mutilation, but the light of honor. This gleam replaced words. Archaeological evidence shows that some prostheses were adorned with engraving, patterns, letters, legion symbols. Perhaps this was a way to return individuality to the body, to make the metal a part of oneself. In one found fragment, the Latin word spes, hope, is visible. The metal on which this word was engraved preserved more than flesh. It preserved meaning. Many historians debate how widespread this phenomenon was. Some believe that prostheses were rare and a privilege of wealthy veterans. Others, relying on epigraphic inscriptions and inventory lists, assert that military workshops already existed under Augustus, where similar devices were created for the wounded. Likely the truth lies somewhere in between. Noble warriors had complex constructions, while commoners had wooden crutches covered in leather. But the idea was one: even after the loss of a body, a person remained part of the army. During the time of Trajan, at the beginning of the 2nd century, Roman medicine reached a particular flourishing. Field hospitals appeared, valetudinaria. These camp infirmaries had separate rooms for long-term treatment. There, Medici and Fabri worked together, creating new limbs for veterans. It was a factory of rebirth, where metal transformed into an extension of flesh. Thus was born the legend of the Iron People, those who survived the sword but did not yield. And although stories about them rarely made it into the chronicles, their steps were heard in every camp. Their clatter on the stone reminded young soldiers, pain passes, but honor remains. But everything would change when the empire faced a new type of war, one where wounds would cease to be a symbol of valor and become proof of the system's own ruthlessness. When Rome entered an era of endless border wars, the metal on veterans' bodies became not just a symbol of strength, it transformed into a sign of the empire's exhaustion. The 3rd century AD brought new wars, not for glory but for survival. Northern provinces burned, legions fought with Germans and Sarmatians, and military doctors were insufficient even for dressings. Tacitus wrote that in some camps dozens of warriors lay without legs and arms, but no one dared to complain. War did not wait for a man to recover. It simply moved on. Nevertheless, even in this dark age, Roman engineering did not disappear. In the camps of the Danube and Rhine, archaeologists find fragments of prostheses, bronze clasps, strap fragments, connecting rings. All this points to the existence of permanent workshops at garrisons. There, blacksmiths and medics worked side by side, creating new limbs for those returning from the front line. These people shared a common name, restituti, the restored. One of the terms that appeared during this period was lorica humana. This was the name given to devices that strengthened a warrior's body after injuries. Bronze bands fixed the spine. Iron frames replaced thigh bones. This was no longer just a prosthesis. It was an exoskeleton of its time. Perhaps crude and heavy, but it allowed a person to move, stand, and serve. The image of those years was not the splendor of the forums, but the smell of metal and sweat. In the silence of the hospitals, one could hear the creak of straps, the rasp of a saw, a dull thud as doctors pressed a new part against the bone. Roman mercy was iron, just like the empire itself. It did not caress, it demanded endurance. But it was precisely this that made the Romans invincible for so long. The loss of a limb was not considered the end. If a person could hold a spear with one hand or stand on one leg, he was still a soldier. Commanders like Septimius Severus encouraged such veterans. They became instructors in training camps, symbols of indomitability. Sometimes they were entrusted with guarding the standards, the ensigns of the legions. This was the highest form of trust. Historians note, at this time, medicine could no longer cope without systemic support. The first forms of military prosthetics appeared. In some provinces, for example in Pannonia, the state even financed special forges. Inscriptions like Officina Medica, medical workshop, are found on discovered slabs. Where catapults were once repaired, now people were restored. However, not everyone saw heroism in this. Senators complained that veterans with injuries became a reminder of the excessive cost of war. According to Dio Cassius, in Rome, one could increasingly see people whose bodies were held together by copper, like statues, but their eyes were empty. This phrase was not just a description, it was a diagnosis of the era. The empire forged prostheses faster than it forged victories. And yet, even in this darkness, the Roman idea of duty did not fade. When the wounded could no longer be returned to battle, they were entrusted with guarding warehouses, barracks, prisons. Some received the title of custos, guardian. They were the last line of order in a world where everything was crumbling. And if their steps sounded heavy, it was not the noise of iron, but the echo of stubbornness. In the cultural memory of those years, a special attitude towards the body emerged. Craftsmen began depicting warriors with metal limbs in mosaics and statues. These were not pitiable cripples, but heroes equal to gods. One such mosaic was found in Antioch, a man in armor, leaning on a bronze leg, with a helmet and spear beside him. His gaze is directed upwards, as if he is ready for a new battle. This image is a manifesto of faith in the invincibility of the human spirit. At this same time, the term virtus, meaning valor, acquired a new resonance. Now, valor was not only victory, but also the ability to rise after defeat. As the historian Aelius Aristides wrote, the body may be wounded, but the will is not. Archaeological finds confirm that Romans even began to use lead inserts in joints to enhance mobility. Some modern doctors compare these finds to prototypes of orthopedic implants. It was an age of pain, but also an age of discoveries, and when the empire began to lose territories, when legions retreated and cities emptied, People with iron arms and bronze legs still walked the roads. Their gait was dull, but confident. They carried not standards, they carried memory. Memory of a time when a person, having lost flesh, did not lose meaning. But Rome was yet to face its final transformation. When swords fell silent and forges quieted, the question would remain, what was all this for? For honor? For duty? Or for the belief that a person is capable of becoming more than their body? The 4th century AD became a time when Rome, as if looking at itself in a mirror, saw not only iron, but also scars. The empire still held on, but its heart beat weaker. Legions no longer marched but stretched like shadows. Veterans with metal limbs now filled the city streets, becoming living chronicles of wars. They were called mutilati, the maimed, but this word sounded not like an insult but like a title. They were a reminder. The price of greatness is always paid with flesh. During this period, statues of warriors with bronze arms and legs appeared in the arenas of the Forum, in basilicas, and even in temples. Some were crafted with anatomical precision. Joints, hinges, and traces of strap fixation were visible, but the main thing was the expression on their faces. It was not suffering, but calmness. Stoics of Constantine's era wrote, "He who has lost a part of his body for duty has lost nothing." This was a philosophy of accepting pain as part of service. However, changes were occurring within the state's structure. The army became less and less civilian and increasingly mercenary. The state could no longer afford generous pensions and workshops for every injured person. Then, veteran fraternities emerged, self-governing communities where old soldiers helped each other. They shared not only bread but also crafts. Blacksmiths taught young men to make prostheses. Doctors passed on knowledge about dressings and amputations. The term describing this process is collegium. These were associations, similar to guilds. Some of them specialized specifically in helping veterans. Archaeological finds from Africa and Sicily mention donations for instrumenta ad corpus restituendum, instruments for restoring the body. This means that even during periods of decline, Rome preserved the idea. A person deserves to be whole, even if their body is broken. In the workshops, everything at hand was used: bronze, iron, tin, wood, leather, sometimes even animal bone. Prostheses became simpler, cruder, but did not disappear. One example found in Narbonne is a wooden leg, reinforced with an iron ring, with holes for straps. Its weight is about 2 kilograms, uncomfortable but allowing one to walk. In an era when the empire was collapsing, even such an ability to walk was a luxury. One of the most touching archaeological artifacts from those years is an inscription on a veteran's tombstone in Arelate. "Stood when others fell." No name, no titles, just this phrase. Perhaps it belonged to a person who stood on a metal leg. This simple inscription became the epitaph of an entire generation. Christianity, strengthening at this time, brought a new understanding of suffering. Now, physical pain was perceived not as shame, but as purification. A wounded warrior could be closer to holiness than a flawless patrician. Frescoes in late Roman temples depict soldiers with bandaged arms and legs, symbols of courage and sacrifice. Rome, weary of war, began to worship not conquerors, but survivors. Against this backdrop, prosthetics ceased to be a military necessity and became an act of mercy. In monasteries that arose on the ruins of old barracks, monk healers continued the work of military medics. They used old tools, described by Celsus, and made the simplest crutches and supports for the poor. Thus, knowledge did not die with the empire. It simply changed form. Gradually, the legends of iron people turned into parables. In 5th century chronicles, there are stories of veterans whose bodies were partially of copper and partially of courage. Historians debate how much of this is a metaphor, but one thing is clear. In Rome's collective memory, iron became synonymous with human resilience. The last decades of the empire were a time of external world destruction and internal strengthening. People lost cities but retained the ability to rise. A prosthesis, perhaps crude, creaking, but their own, became a symbol of independence. A veteran with an iron arm did not ask for mercy. He simply forged a new life, just as he once forged a sword. When Rome fell in 476 AD, its ruins contained not only columns and marble, but also fragments of bronze joints, shards of iron supports. Archaeologists find them even today, silent witnesses that the empire could lose everything except the ability to rise again. And here is the question that echoes through the centuries. What motivated these people? What compelled them to rise after fate took away not only their flesh, but also their empire? The answer is still ahead, in what will remain of their spirit when the metal cools and memory becomes legend. When the Roman world disappeared, the iron cooled, but the memory did not fade. With each century, the legends of warriors with bronze legs and iron arms became more than just stories of craftsmanship. They were lessons in humanity. Archaeologists exploring ancient necropolises find the remains of these prostheses and see in them not technical devices but a symbol, proof that humans have always tried to overcome their own fragility. For a modern scientist, every piece of bronze is an answer to the question legionaries asked themselves 2,000 years ago. What does it mean to be human if your body is broken? The Romans answered simply, it means to keep walking. Their iron legs did not make them superhuman. They merely restored their ability to stand. But to stand means to live. This is why their legacy has not disappeared. The principles of load distribution, hinged joints, even the idea of weight balancing, all of this became the foundation for modern prostheses. Every step on asphalt, taken with a bionic leg, echoes across the cobblestones of ancient Capua. From there, from the iron clank on stone, began the story of human restoration. Philosophers said, corpus perit, animus manet. The body perishes, the spirit remains. And perhaps this is the main meaning of the entire Roman idea. For iron arms and bronze legs were not an adornment of war, but a challenge to death. Now, knowing this history, one should ask oneself, what makes us human? A whole body or an unbroken will? We live in a world where technology has restored the ability to walk to those who could not, but the very idea of struggle has remained the same. The man from Capua stepping on his iron leg across the ashes of the empire, and the person today taking their first step after an amputation are one and the same person, separated not by time, but by material. And when metal clinks underfoot, it reminds us, true strength is not in bronze and not in steel. It is in the heart that keeps walking, even when the ground beneath it trembles.